My name is Alec Longstreth. I draw the comic book Phase 7. And the first comic book that I fell in love with was Uncle Scrooge, number 219, which was drawn by Don Rosa. It was his first story for Disney Comics. And I grew up reading Karl Barks, who did the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories for 25 years, and they were reprinted when I was a kid in the 80s. And Don Rosa was sort of the second coming of Barks. He was the first other duck artist that drew really great stories. They were really sort of in the canon of Donald Duck stories. So when that comic book came out, I just freaked out, and knew I was going to be a lifelong fan. It was actually really hard to find because it was a popular comic. My dad found it in New York City, and he called me on a payphone and said, "I finally found Uncle Scrooge, number 219." And I was like, "Ah!" And I couldn't wait for him to get home from his business trip so that I could read the comic book. That's my favorite comic.
So what is it about that comic that made you love it so much? Like, what stuck in your mind?
It's got a really highly detailed drawing style. Don Rosa is a self-taught cartoonist, so he takes each panel and he just packs it with detail. So there's sort of the foreground story that's happening. You know, Uncle Scrooge is like, "We got to go over there," but he always like hid little gags in the background. So there's always rats running around or people getting thrown out of windows or little things happening in the background. So it's really fun when you're a kid to pour over it. You know, you can read it over and over and over again. You're always noticing new details.
Hi, I'm Aaron Nell Steinke. I'm a cartoonist, and I'm also a teacher. I do a autobiographical comic series called Big Plans, and more recently a comic strip called Mr. Wolf, based on my experience of teaching. I also do comics for kids. The very first comic I fell in love with, oh my god. I guess it would have to be, it was probably some issue of Wolverine, and I hate to say that it's some issue because I don't remember the exact one. There was maybe 2 issues where Wolverine had his hand up, and there were 3, you know, there's claws coming out.
Yep, there's the Hulk cover by Todd McFarlane.
I don't remember what issue, but and so I didn't really fall in love with the comic itself, but I fell in love with the cover, and I fell in love with the comics that day. My dad and I were working the flea market selling soda machines, and he had been a big fan of comics when he was a kid. Luckily, he got to read Western comics during the golden age of comic books, and he read a lot of things that way. So he just gave me a bunch of money to go buy some comics, and that was the start of the comic love for me. I think I was 12. No, I was probably 9 years old, 10 years old.
Hi, I'm Frank M. Young, and I'm the co-author / colorist of The Carter Family, Don't Forget This Song, and the writer of The Oregon Trail, Road to Destiny, both of which were drawn by my esteemed colleague David Lasky. And the first comics, I was an omnivorous devourer of comics from pretty much the cradle. And the first few years of my life, there was really not much quality control in my input. I basically would read anything if it was in comics form. But when I was 8 or 9, 2 very different types of comics really got to me. One was the Mad Magazine's specials would have these reprints of the Mad comics from the 50s in them as a bonus. And it'd be like a 32-page comic book tucked into the crappy Mad special. And that was the first time I'd seen the real 1950s Harvey Kurtzman, Will Elder stuff. And I just became obsessed with those. And I remember buying extra copies and tearing the front cover off so I could pry the comic out. And they did 5 or 6 of those, I think, and they really shaped my overall love of comics, and particularly of that there were really good comics that were challenging and said something about the world and were really funny. And then right about the same time, I got obsessed with old issues of a comic called Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen, which are these reading them now, they're these delightfully twisted and crazy and weird comics, but at the age of 8 or 9, I took them completely at face value. And as an adult, I can read them now and savor the craziness that just hypnotized me. And I still see something in both of those comics that compels me. So basically, you can't read those Jimmy Olsen comics now without thinking that Superman basically hated the entire human race, and he used Jimmy Olsen to take out his contempt on him, because he was constantly humiliating him, debasing him, changing his appearance, and then at the end of the story he'd always say, "Well, I hope you learned your lesson, Jimmy." And what did Jimmy do to deserve any of this? He was just trying to be a cub reporter and wear bow ties neatly, and anyway, Harvey Kurtzman and Mort Weisinger. There you go.
My favorite comic as a kid was Garfield, probably until I was like 12. Back in the 80s when I was a kid, and when Garfield first came out, they had these rectangular editions of the book, and it would be like 2 strips per page. And you know, as a 7-year-old, it was just the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And I was a dog person. We always had dogs growing up, but I think even at that early age, I related to John, the lovable loser, and his cat that makes fun of him, and Odie. So I think I had probably the first 15 of those rectangular ones.
Oh, I remember those. Yeah, Garfield has lunch. Garfield eats lasagna. Garfield makes fun of John.
Yeah. And I always loved that you could go back to the first one and see like how Garfield looked at the beginning and how he evolved over because it took like a year or two until he started looking like how Garfield looks these days. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not romanticizing it. I've gone back and read some of them, and they don't really hold up, but it meant a lot to me at that age. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pete Cesari. The comic that I remember, fell in love with when I was younger. A friend of mine lived in Malden, Massachusetts, and we went to go visit the New England comics near him, and there was a man named Ben Inland who was signing, and grabbed a copy of The Tick Zero, and had a little die-cut window with it, crossword puzzle behind it. Flames. I remember the cover very well. And we met Ben, and great guy. He signed the book, and I grabbed a couple issues, went home and read, and I've never been a comic book person, I've never been a superhero person, and it was so anti-hero. I fell in love with these second-rate, makeshift power characters. It was just a wonderful universe. I loved the villains, I loved the heroes. There was so much about it that was not the norm, and I think that was sort of my intro into the indie world of things. So it would have to be The Tick. It was probably the first thing that I fell in love with.
Hi, my name's James Stamp, and I draw Nartoons, and the first comic I ever fell in love with was Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes, just reading it in the Sunday newspaper. I used to cut them out and glue them together into little books and staple them, and love Bill Watterson.
What about him? Like, were there certain strips you loved more than others?
I like all the dinosaurs. I'm a sucker for dinosaurs, the beautiful brushwork. I think that's more, I've fallen in love with that more as I've gotten older. I don't think I noticed that when I was little. I just liked how imaginative it was, and I think I could relate to it when I was a kid. And I still like it now, so that speaks well to him.
I'm Mark Paul, organizer of The Intruder. The first comic that I really fell in love with was probably the first few issues of Madman by Mike Allred. That stuff, it changed my mind, changed my world as far as like superhero stuff or how comics can look and be as fun as they are. So, yeah.
What about it that really got you?
I don't know, it was the groundingness of it. Like, it was really realistic and a little bit like adult and weird, but also like really absurd and just funny. It just looked great. Just black and white and like gray, or like this purpley gray color.
Oh, you go way back to the original first issue.
That's the old Batman, the original. So that was the one that like maybe. I would still say his influence is on me today. So.
Okay, it was an Uncle Scrooge comic. This was in the 80s, some reprint, and it was a Karl Barks thing where they discover a golden waterfall. They take Scrooge. He's getting too stressed out about his money, so they take him into the country, and Scrooge finds this waterfall that's it's a golden waterfall, but it only flows certain times, and every time he goes over there to try to collect the gold, it turns back into water.
So anyway, so he eventually figures out that he has to not be greedy in order for it to flow gold. So he tries to not be greedy on purpose, and it doesn't work. It's still just water. And then once he genuinely, Donald and the nephews sort of trick him into genuinely being nice. And once he's genuinely nice, then the waterfall flows. And that's like basically how every Scrooge story works, which I think is interesting because like it's okay, once you are not greedy, it's okay to then collect millions. Anyway, so I always liked that. There was a moral, but it was kind of, in hindsight now, I'm not sure that was...
Yeah, I'm kind of wrestling with that too. It's okay to be greedy because, or not to be greedy because it'll get you what you want ultimately. But
Right. Like you should still get the money in the end, but you just shouldn't want the money. Once you don't want it, then you get it. Which that's kind of a universal principle. So yeah, as a kid, that was a powerful story.
I'm Pat Moriarty, and the comic book that got my attention when I was a youngster was American Splendor by Harvey Pekar. And that made me interested in autobiographical comics. And from there I went on to Dennis Eichhorn, who's sitting right there. And I got into doing my big mouth comics that have an autobiographical spin.
So what about Harvey's approach kind of made you excited?
That it was nothing like superhero comics. It was based on real life stuff. And that it wasn't necessarily about action, it was more cerebral. That's what it was. And the fact that he was a regular human being.
It's weird reading about regular human beings. That's one of the things that really blew me away about American Splendor. Had you been reading other comics before, undergrounds or superhero books, or?
Well, it started with Crumb, and I really love Crumb's artwork, but I can't quite take the sexual perversion so much. So when Crumb and Pekar started to collaborate, I thought it was the perfect storm of writing and art. Pekar's writing grabbed me, and Crumb's artwork grabbed me, and so it was like a dangerous combination. And that's what started, that's what got it for me. I went from Crumb to Pekar, and that's my favorite recipe.